Magnus Carlsen plays like Paul Morphy in this game against Levon Aronian from the Superbet Blitz in Poland. It's 5 minutes for each side with a 2-second increment. In the rapid portion of this tournament, Magnus did not play very well, and he was down at the bottom. But this Blitz portion, Magnus has been on a tear. He is playing incredible chess and has a good chance of winning the entire tournament in what would be one of the more impressive comebacks in recent chess history. Let's go over this game because it's such a rare treat to see a 2800 play a center gambit against another elite player. Magnus begins with e4. Levon Aronian plays e5. And the first surprise, Magnus plays d4. Not very common. Usually it introduces the center game after ed4. White takes with the queen, and you get a central position. And believe it or not, White's this is an okay position for White, even though the queen will get kicked around a little bit. But after ed4, Magnus gives us his second surprise, which is c3, offering up a gambit. Now, if Black takes this pawn, White can take with the knight, and this is what's called the Gehring gambit. But for the more daring, you can play, bishop c4, and let the b2 pawn be taken. Bishop takes, and this is the Danish gambit, with these two very powerful bishops just screaming along the board. This is very dangerous for Black. So Levon Aronian instead plays d5. This is an attempt by Black to diffuse the situation and decline the extra pawn. So Magnus takes the pawn, and usually Black takes with the queen here. And the variation goes something like this: cd4, knight c6, knight f3, and after a pin, bishop b4 check, knight c3. You take on f3, and then queen to c4. Black is keeping White from castling kingside, and also Black is going to castle long himself, and this position is fairly even. But Aronian plays something a little less common. He plays the move knight to f6, going after this pawn immediately with the knight instead of the queen. Magnus just calmly develops his knight to f3. And again, Aronian could just take with the queen and transpose to the variation that we just looked at, but instead he takes with the knight. So in this way, Magnus doesn't have to weaken his pawn structure, and he doesn't. He takes with the queen on d4. However, now Aronian is going to try to win some tempos by kicking Magnus's queen around a little bit. He plays knight to c6, immediately attacking Magnus's queen. But instead of moving that queen, instead Magnus plays bishop to b5, pinning the c6 knight to the king so it cannot take the queen. And here Aronian plays a novelty. He plays the move queen to e7 check. The computer preference and the database preference is just a calm bishop to e7. Queen to e7 check, though, puts a lot of pressure on White's position, but it also puts some pressure on Black's position. His queen is lined up with his own king as well. And Magnus plays a very aggressive move here. He plays the move knight to e5. He's actually pinning his own knight on e5. He's walking into a pin, but he's putting a lot of pressure on this knight on c6 that is now attacked by the bishop and the knight, although the knight can't take it at the moment because it is pinned, but it's definitely the most aggressive move in the position. Bishop to d7 to relieve some of the pressure on that knight on c6. Bishop takes c6. Bishop takes c6 and castles. So now the knight is no longer pinned, and Magnus is threatening to take the bishop on c6 and wreck Aronian's queenside pawn structure. So to avoid that pawn structure damage, Aronian plays the queen to e6. That way, when Magnus takes the bishop, he can retake with the queen. Now, at the moment, he has the bishop pair, so Magnus does take that bishop off of the board. Queen takes knight. But here, rook to e1 check. So now the tables are turning. Aronian wanted to avoid the pressure of the gambit, but as it turns out, Magnus is applying pressure anyway. Now, if he blocks that check with the knight in order to save the g7 pawn, then bishop to f4. Black cannot castle because the queen covers this square, and you can't castle over check. But if he played rook to d8, he would lose the a7 pawn. So in this position after bishop f4, White is in very good shape. So instead, Aronian goes ahead and plays bishop to e7, blocking it that way, but that does mean that his g7 pawn hangs. So Magnus takes that pawn, and Aronian castles long. I think his hope is that he can generate pressure on this half-open g-file against Magnus's king on g1. But watch this maneuver from Magnus. This is a super GM maneuver. he plays queen to g4 check, forcing the king over, and then queen to f3. The queen is perfectly placed at f3. It's not a target down the g-file, yet it defends the g2 pawn, and it creates a pin on the knight because Magnus would love to trade queens here because he's up a pawn. Bishop to c5 from Aronian. Now knight to d2, threatening the knight to b3, hitting the bishop on c5. The bishop's more valuable than the knight, so that would be a strong maneuver from Magnus. And here Aronian plays queen to f6. Now, this is probably not the best move because essentially he's offering the trade of queens into an endgame down a pawn against Magnus Carlsen. That is a very tricky proposition. And Magnus says, okay, you want it, you got it. And he goes ahead and exchanges those queens right then and there. Knight takes f6, knight to b3, hitting the bishop on c5, which now goes back to b6. And what does Magnus do? Bishop to e3. He says, I'm up a pawn, so I have no problem just exchanging pieces. I'll challenge that bishop on b6 immediately with bishop to e3. Rook h to e8. He goes ahead and takes that bishop at b6. A b6, and now knight to d4. This is a very nice square for this knight. Knight to e4 from Aronian. g3, this eliminates any back rank possibilities. There weren't really any on the board, but sort of just in case. And the king can activate via the g2, f3 squares. The knight goes to d6. Aronian's idea, he wants to play the move c5 and kick this knight away, but he wants to cover the b5 square and the f5 square first, so the knight has to go backwards when he hits it with c5. King goes to g2, and now c5 comes, and those two squares aren't available, so the knight goes to f3. King to c7, rook e8, again exchanging pieces, and Magnus offers the exchange of rooks. Now, if Aronian exchanges rooks, his chances of winning are much lower. Being a pawn down in a knight endgame is a very difficult thing to deal with. The best scenario for black here is going to be rook versus rook. That's the most likely arrangement of pieces to save this game. So he keeps the rook on the board. He plays rook to a8, attacks the a2 pawn. In the process, Magnus plays a3 to defend that pawn. h6, that keeps the knight out of g5. Rook to e7 check, and king to d8. And all of these squares are covered on the 7th rank. So Magnus's rook has to retreat, goes back to e2. b5, expanding on the queen side, and now knight to e5, with the threat of playing knight g4 and hitting that h6 pawn. The pawn advances, he goes to f6, etc., etc. Now the king goes to c7. But this turns out to be a mistake in an already difficult position. Magnus plays knight takes f7, and in this position, Aronian resigned. And the reason was this: if knight takes f7, then rook to e7 check, picks up the knight by checking the king, and he's up 2 pawns in a rook endgame and without any real counterplay for black. And if the knight moves, say, to c4, then you just take on h6, and it's 3 pawns in that case. So it's great to see not only a top player play a gambit, but when it is declined, he still gets that pressure that you want from the opening. I hope you've enjoyed this game. It's been a great day of chess. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.